The lecture hall had gone quiet the moment his name was whispered. The boy nobody looked at, the one they called the campus ghost. She was the only one who ever spoke up for him, the only one who saw a person where everyone else saw a shadow. She never asked why he flinched at crowds, why his eyes carried winters she couldn't explain. Then came the black cars, the bowed heads, the men in suits who called him nothing less than Your Highness. The boy she had defended in empty hallways was the same man an entire underworld feared as the White Wolf King. What had she truly stepped into, and why had he let her get close enough to find out? Stay until the end to see how far this secret really goes, and tell us in the comments what you would have done in her place. My name is Daniel Hart, and if you'd told me at the start of the semester that I would end up falling for the most silent, invisible boy at Lindenhall Academy, I would have laughed in your face and gone back to counting the coins in my jacket pocket to see if I could afford both dinner and a textbook that week. Lindenhall sat above the town of Grindelwald like something out of an old postcard. Gray stone towers wrapped in fog, the Eiger looming behind it so close you could believe the mountain was listening in on every lecture. It was the kind of school where half the student body arrived by private helicopter, and the other half, like me, arrived by a scholarship application filled out at midnight with trembling hands. I was an Omega. In most of Europe, that fact barely raised an eyebrow anymore. The old hierarchies had softened into something more like inconvenient etiquette than law. But at a school like Lindenhall, where half my classmates were the heirs of alpha dynasties that still kept private physicians on retainer for compatibility screenings, being a poor, unbonded, scholarship Omega made me exactly three things: invisible, underestimated, and, according to my best friend Charlotte, a walking invitation for trouble. "You're doing the thing again," Charlotte said one gray Tuesday morning, sliding into the seat beside me in the dining hall where I was, in fact, working, not eating. I had approximately 4 minutes before my shift busing tables actually started, and I was using them to reread a macroeconomics chapter I did not understand even slightly. "What thing?" "The thing where you stare at James Voss like he's a puzzle you're trying to solve." I nearly knocked over a stack of saucers. "I do not." "You do. Every lecture, you've got a whole system, row of desks. Third from the window. Gray hoodie, black glasses, never talks, never looks up, writes with his left hand like he's trying to hide the paper from spies." Charlotte popped a grape into her mouth with the satisfaction of someone who has just won an argument she started. "You've been cataloging him for weeks." She wasn't wrong, which was the annoying part. James Voss was, by every visible measure, the most forgettable person at Lindenhall. A first year like me, always curled into an oversized charcoal hoodie, 2 sizes too big, hair falling into his eyes, shoulders drawn in like he was trying to physically take up less space than the world had allotted him. He sat alone, he ate alone, he never so much as glanced toward the tables where the alpha heirs held court with their expensive watches and louder than necessary laughter. And yet, every single time Professor Halverson handed back an economics exam, I caught the same flash of red ink at the top of James Voss's paper before he tucked it away like contraband, a plus every time. While I was drowning, actually genuinely drowning, my scholarship required a 3.0 average, and I currently had the GPA equivalent of a body floating face down in a swimming pool. There was, I'd noticed, one other constant in that lecture hall, a quiet, unremarkable man in a gray cardigan who sat near the back marking papers with the kind of stillness that made you forget he was there at all. Constantine, I'd once heard Halverson call him, when he needed a set of exams delivered to the registrar. A teaching assistant, apparently, though I couldn't recall him ever once speaking directly to a student. He simply existed at the edges of the room, watching the way a coat rack exists at the edge of a room, present, useful, entirely beneath notice. I filed him away without a second thought, the same way you file away a fire extinguisher or an emergency exit sign, important only in theory, until suddenly it isn't. "He's probably a genius hiding from the world," Charlotte said thoughtfully, of James, not Constantine, whom she had never once mentioned noticing at all. Or a serial killer. Statistically, it could go either way. Comforting. "I'm just saying, if you're going to ask your economics crush for tutoring, do it before finals, not during the apocalypse." I did not have a crush. I had a survival strategy with a face I found, admittedly, more interesting than it had any right to be. It took me 3 days to work up the nerve. 3 days of hovering near the library's east wing, where James Voss retreated after every class, like a man escaping a burning building, always to the same dusty corner behind the ancient agricultural records. Nobody had checked out since the Ottoman Empire still had opinions about Europe. "You've been standing there for 4 minutes," he said, without looking up, the moment I finally approached. His voice caught me completely off guard, not the reedy, uncertain murmur I'd built in my head, but low even, and layered with an odd, quiet authority that made the fine hairs on my arms lift like a held breath. How did you know I was?" "You breathe loudly when you're nervous." He finally lifted his head, and there they were, his eyes, half hidden behind smudged glasses, a pale, startling gray blue, like ice with sunlight caught underneath it. They studied me with an unsettling, unhurried patience, the way you'd study a chess move rather than a person. "You're failing Halverson's class." It wasn't a question. "How? You've rewritten the same supply curve 4 times this week. Wrong each time." A faint twitch pulled at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, more like the ghost of one passing through. Consistently wrong, which is almost impressive. Something about the dry, understated way he said it made heat crawl up the back of my neck. Embarrassment, I told myself. Definitely embarrassment, and not the way his voice seemed to settle somewhere low in my chest, like a stone dropped into still water. "I need a tutor," I said, dropping the pretense entirely, because pride is an expensive luxury I could not afford. "I'll pay you, whatever you charge." James Voss closed his notebook slowly, the sound of the pages meeting oddly final, like a door shutting somewhere far away. "I don't need your money. Then what do you want?" He considered me for a long moment, long enough that I became uncomfortably aware of my own heartbeat, of the specific, absurd fact that I had not brushed my hair properly that morning, of the fact that this quiet, guarded stranger was looking at me like he was deciding something important. "Tuesdays and Thursdays," he said finally. "Here, don't be late." A pause. "And Hart, bring better pens. Watching you use that dying blue biro is causing me actual physical pain." I did not, in that moment, register that he already knew my last name. I was far too busy trying to figure out why my pulse was doing something complicated and unhelpful. The first real crack in the wall around James Voss happened 2 weeks later, on a Thursday, in front of roughly 40 witnesses, and it started, as the most humiliating things in my life tend to, with me completely misreading the situation. I was cutting across the east courtyard toward the library when I saw them. 3 third years, all alphas, all wearing the specific, smug swagger of boys who had never once in their lives been told no. They'd cornered James against the stone balustrade near the old chapel, and one of them, Richard Colborne, heir to some shipping fortune, and a boy I'd personally watched throw a tantrum over cold coffee, had a fistful of James's hoodie. "Just want to know why a scholarship reject like you gets the private study wing, Voss. That's reserved for people who actually matter here." James said nothing. He simply stood there, shoulders drawn in, head down, glasses slipping, looking to my eyes, exactly like a boy about to be genuinely hurt. I did not think. I have never claimed to think clearly in moments of crisis. It is, according to Charlotte, my single most dangerous personality trait. I dropped my bag and marched directly into the middle of it, inserting myself bodily between Richard Colborne and James Voss, with all the tactical judgment of a man throwing himself in front of a train, because the train looked lonely. "Leave him alone," I said, in a voice that came out significantly braver than I felt. Richard blinked at me like I'd materialized from thin air. "Excuse me? You heard me. He's not bothering anyone." "Pick on someone your own." "Actually, no. Pick on someone with actual power, because clearly 3 of you cornering one guy who hasn't said a word is exactly the kind of bravery your family fortune bought you." There was a beat of stunned silence. Somewhere behind me, I heard Charlotte make a strangled noise that I would later learn was her trying not to laugh. Richard's face went an interesting shade of red. "Do you have any idea who you're talking to? A coward with a trust fund?" I fully expected to be decked. What I did not expect was for Richard's 2 friends to go pale. Not embarrassed pale, but genuinely, physically pale, the way you go when you've realized you're standing far too close to something dangerous. One of them actually took a full step backward. "Rich," the taller one hissed. "Rich, look at his eyes." I turned, following their line of sight, and found James Voss looking directly at Richard Colborne, and something about his expression had changed entirely. The quiet, careful quality was gone. His spine had straightened, his chin had lifted, and his eyes behind those smudged glasses had gone sharp and pale and terribly, terribly calm, like the surface of a lake right before it freezes solid. "Richard," James said, and his voice hadn't gotten louder, but it filled the entire courtyard anyway, low and even and edged with something I couldn't name yet. "You should let go of my sleeve. You're wrinkling it." Richard let go so fast you'd think the fabric had caught fire. "We were just," he started. "Leaving," James finished for him. "You were just leaving." They left. All three of them, at a pace that was not quite running, but was absolutely not walking either, disappearing around the chapel like they'd remembered an urgent appointment somewhere very far away. I stood there, adrenaline draining out of me in a dizzying rush, staring after them. What was that? James straightened his sleeve with 2 careful fingers, glasses catching the gray afternoon light. "That," he said, "was you nearly getting yourself expelled defending a person who did not, in fact, require defending. They had you cornered. They were annoying me," he corrected. "There's a difference." I opened my mouth to argue and then closed it again, because something about the flat, dry certainty in his voice made me suddenly, deeply suspicious that I had just heroically rescued a boy who could have ended that entire confrontation with a single sentence at any point he chose. "You're welcome, by the way," I said instead, because pride is a stubborn thing, even when it's clearly misplaced. For the first time since I'd met him, James Voss actually smiled, small, crooked, startlingly warm against the sharp lines of his face, like sunlight breaking through cloud cover for exactly 3 seconds before vanishing again. "Noted, Hart." He picked up my dropped bag and held it out to me. "Tuesday. Bring the good pens." I took the bag. Our fingers brushed for half a second, and I felt it travel up my arm like static electricity, like the specific, unmistakable warmth of skin meeting skin that omegas are taught from childhood to be careful of, to guard, to never hand out carelessly. I told myself it meant nothing. I was even then already lying to myself rather badly. The emotional shift, the moment I would later point to and say that, right there, that's when I stopped pretending this was just tutoring, happened 3 days after the courtyard incident, on an evening when the sky over Grindelwald opened up without warning and turned the cobblestone paths into small, treacherous rivers. I'd missed the last covered shuttle back to the dormitories because I'd stayed late finishing my shift in the dining hall, and by the time I stepped outside, the rain was coming down in sheets, cold enough to bite, and I had exactly 1 thin jacket and a backpack full of books I could not afford to ruin. "You're going to catch pneumonia," said a familiar low voice, from somewhere just behind my left shoulder, and I turned to find James Voss standing under the narrow stone archway, hood up, watching the rain with the mild, unbothered expression of a man observing weather from an entirely different climate. "I have a jacket." "You have a wet paper towel wearing a jacket's clothes." He stepped out from under the archway, without hesitation, shrugged off his heavy gray coat, the oversized one, the one that had made him look small and unremarkable for weeks, and settled it over my shoulders before I could protest. It was enormous on me. It smelled like cedar and old library paper, and something warmer underneath, something distinctly, dizzyingly him, and I felt my whole body go strangely, embarrassingly still. "James, you'll freeze." "I run warm." He said it simply, like a fact about the weather, and started walking, matching his pace to mine, so I had no choice but to follow or stand there alone in the downpour. Alphas usually do. We walked back to the dormitories together, under a single umbrella he produced from some inner pocket of his bag like a magic trick, shoulders pressed close, his coat swallowing my frame, rain drumming a soft rhythm against the stretched black fabric above our heads. Neither of us spoke for a long stretch of the path, and yet the silence didn't feel empty. It felt full of the sound of rain, of our footsteps falling almost in sync, of his shoulder occasionally brushing mine, and neither of us moving away from the contact. "Why'd you really step in front of Colborne?" James asked eventually, quiet, like he'd been turning the question over for 3 days before deciding to ask it aloud. I considered lying. Because it was wrong. What they were doing. That's not what I asked. I glanced sideways at him, at the rain sliding down the sharp line of his jaw, at the way his glasses had fogged slightly at the edges, at the unfairly handsome face he kept hidden under hoodies, and lowered eyes for reasons I still didn't understand. "Because," I said slowly, "somewhere in the last 2 weeks, I started caring what happened to you, which is inconvenient, since you're clearly hiding something, and I have exactly 0 bandwidth in my life for more complications." James was quiet for 3 full steps. Then, I'm not hiding anything. You wear a coat 2 sizes too big and glasses I'm fairly sure are fake, and you made 3 third-year alphas flee a courtyard with 1 sentence. Either you're secretly a very well-dressed spy, or you're something else entirely, and I would genuinely like to know which, because I'd rather not fall for either without at least being warned. I hadn't meant to say the last part. It slipped out, unguarded, into the rain-soaked dark, and I felt my ears go hot the instant the words left my mouth. James stopped walking. For a moment I thought I'd ruined everything, crossed some line I couldn't see, said the one thing that would send this careful, guarded version of him retreating for good. Instead, he reached out, slowly, giving me every opportunity to step back, and tucked a damp strand of hair away from my face with 2 fingers, his touch gentle and deliberate against my cold skin. "You shouldn't fall for me, Hart," he said, low and rough at the edges, his ice-pale eyes searching mine with an intensity that made my breath catch somewhere behind my ribs. "It would complicate things far more than you realize." Is that a warning or a challenge? The corner of his mouth curved, quick, private, unpracticed, like he wasn't used to letting it show. "Depends how stubborn you are." "Very," I admitted. "Yes," he said softly, resuming our walk before I could ask him to explain the strange, weighted way he'd said that single word. I'd gathered that much already. I went to sleep that night wrapped in the ghost scent of his coat, still hanging over the back of my desk chair because I'd forgotten, or perhaps deliberately failed, to return it, and I lay awake far longer than I should have, replaying the way his fingers had felt against my cheek, warm and careful, and entirely too significant for a boy who supposedly wanted nothing to do with anyone. Whatever had shifted that rainy night carried forward into every tutoring session after, softening the careful distance James had kept for weeks into something warmer, funnier, and considerably more dangerous for my concentration. "You're doing it wrong again," he said one Tuesday, leaning over my shoulder to look at my equations, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating off him even through his sleeve. "The elasticity coefficient goes here, not there. Honestly, Hart, I don't know how you've survived this long. Some of us weren't born knowing supply curves in the womb. Some of us actually attend the lectures instead of drawing elaborate diagrams of my study habits in the margins of our notebook." He tapped the corner of my page, where, mortifyingly, I had indeed sketched a small, unflattering cartoon of him hunched over a book weeks earlier, back when I thought he'd never see it. "That's private, it's adorable, is what it is." His voice had gone warm, teasing, entirely unlike the flat, careful tone he used with everyone else at Lindenhall, and I found myself smiling before I could stop it. "Though you've drawn my nose wrong. It's not that crooked." "It's exactly that crooked. It's very distinguished." Distinguished. He said the word like he was tasting it, clearly delighted, clearly filing it away to use against me later. It became, over the following weeks, an easy rhythm between us, teasing traded back and forth like currency, small touches that lingered a beat longer than strictly necessary, his hand occasionally covering mine to correct the angle of my pen, the warmth of his palm sending heat climbing steadily up my arm every single time. Some Thursdays he brought 2 cups of coffee from the kiosk by the chapel without ever once mentioning it, simply setting one down beside my notebook like it belonged there. Some Tuesdays I brought him the good pens he'd demanded that first day, and watched, absurdly pleased with myself, as he tried each one out on a scrap of paper with the serious concentration of a man testing a new sword. "You're stalling," he told me once, when I'd spent 10 minutes not quite finishing a problem set, purely so the session wouldn't end. "Say what you actually want to say, Hart. You have the subtlety of a brick. I don't want anything. You've redrawn that same axis 4 times. You do that when you're avoiding something." He leaned back, arms crossed, watching me with that unhurried chess move patience that still, weeks later, made my pulse do something unhelpful. "Go on. I'm not going anywhere." I stopped pretending, even to myself, that this was only about economics. Richard Colborne, unfortunately, noticed long before I was ready for anyone else to. "You and the campus ghost," he said one afternoon, cornering me, with slightly less menace and considerably more petulance than the courtyard incident, outside the dining hall. "Everyone's talking about it. Poor scholarship Omega, hanging around Voss like a lovesick puppy." "Jealous?" I asked, mostly to see his face turn that same interesting shade of red. "Please, I could have any Omega on this campus, then go have one, preferably far away from me." You should be careful, Richard said, dropping his voice into something almost sincere, which was somehow more unsettling than his usual arrogance. You don't actually know anything about him, Hart. People like Voss, the quiet ones, the ones who show up out of nowhere with money nobody can trace. They're not hiding from shyness, they're hiding from something, or someone. I wanted to dismiss it as jealousy dressed up as concern. But that night, lying awake with James's coat still draped over my desk chair, I found myself turning Richard's words over and over, unable to fully shake them loose. The jealousy, as it turned out, ran both directions. 2 weeks later, Lindenhall's autumn formal arrived, and in a fit of scholarship omega bravado I would later regret, I accepted a dance from Marcus Ferrand, a perfectly pleasant beta from my economics section, who had approximately zero romantic intentions and simply wanted, in his words, not to stand alone by the punch table looking pathetic. I did not expect James Voss to attend the formal at all, given his consistent record of avoiding every social event Lindenhall had to offer. I certainly did not expect him to appear in an actual tailored suit, dark charcoal, beautifully cut, his hair combed back from his face for the first time since I'd known him, glasses conspicuously absent, looking so unfairly, devastatingly handsome that I nearly dropped my punch cup on Marcus's shoes. James crossed the ballroom floor with the unhurried, deliberate stride of a man who had never once in his life doubted he'd get exactly where he intended to go, and stopped directly beside us mid-song. "May I cut in?" he said. It was not in any meaningful sense a question. Marcus, visibly startled by both the interruption and the sudden, distinct chill in the air around James Voss, released me almost instantly. Yes, of course, absolutely," he said, retreating with the same swift, unnerved pace Richard's friends had used weeks earlier, and I filed that particular detail away with growing suspicion. "That was rude," I told James as his hand settled at my waist, warm even through the fabric of my shirt, guiding me easily into step. "Was it? I thought it was efficient. You scared him. He was holding you too close." James's voice had dropped low, rough around the edges, his pale eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that made the rest of the ballroom blur into unimportant background noise. I didn't like it. My pulse stuttered. "You don't get to be jealous. We're not." "I know what we're not," he said quietly, drawing me a fraction closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him along my entire front, close enough that the cedar and parchment scent of him wrapped around me like his coat had that rainy night. "I would very much like to discuss what we could be, Hart. When you're ready to hear it." I did not, that night, ask him what he meant. I was too busy trying to remember how to breathe with his hand resting against the small of my back. Too busy noticing the way half the ballroom had gone quiet and watchful the moment James Voss stepped onto the dance floor. The way older students and even 2 visiting professors had tracked his movement across the room with an attention that had nothing to do with curiosity and everything to do with something closer to deference. Something was different about him. I was starting, slowly and with great reluctance, to admit that I already knew it. The jealousy, as it turned out, was not confined to that single dance. The following week, a visiting exchange student named William Caro, tall, easy-smiling, entirely oblivious to the quiet chaos he was about to cause, made the grave tactical error of sitting beside me at lunch 3 days running purely, as far as I could tell, because he found economics genuinely fascinating and had run out of other people willing to discuss elasticity theory over sandwiches. James did not sit with us. James, instead, began appearing at increasingly implausible moments in increasingly implausible locations, outside the dining hall exactly when I left it, in the library exactly when I arrived, once memorably, in the corridor outside my one class that had absolutely nothing to do with economics, and therefore no earthly reason for him to be anywhere near. "Are you following me?" I asked him on the 4th such occasion, fighting very hard not to smile. "I have business in this corridor. You're a first-year economics student. This is the Fine Arts building." "I appreciate sculpture," he said, with the flat, unconvincing dignity of a man who had clearly not thought this excuse through in advance. "James, he sat with you 3 days in a row." The admission came out clipped, almost annoyed, and entirely, deliciously transparent. I was simply confirming there was nothing to be concerned about. "There's nothing to be concerned about. I'm aware." I confirmed it. Repeatedly. He said this with such wounded, put-upon dignity that I'd finally lost the fight against my own laughter, and something in his expression shifted at the sound of it, softening, a little sheepish, a little relieved. "You could have just asked me," I told him, still grinning. I am not in the habit of asking questions I already know the humiliating answer to, which is that I've apparently developed the reasoning capacity of a jealous schoolboy over a man who discusses elasticity theory during lunch. He said it dryly, self-deprecating in a way I hadn't heard from him before, and I felt something warm and unguarded bloom in my chest at the admission, at the fact that he'd trusted me enough to let me see it. "For the record," I said, "elasticity theory has never once made my pulse do anything interesting. You, on the other hand, standing in a fine arts corridor pretending to appreciate sculpture, currently are." The look he gave me then, startled, pleased, entirely undone, was worth every ounce of William Caro's baffled confusion at suddenly finding himself eating lunch alone for the rest of the semester. The truth arrived on an ordinary Thursday morning, in the most ordinary way imaginable, which somehow made it more disorienting rather than less. I was crossing the main courtyard, half asleep, coffee in hand, when three black vehicles rolled through Lindenhall's iron gates in tight formation, sleek, unmarked, moving with the quiet, expensive precision of transport that had never once needed to advertise its importance. 6 men in dark suits stepped out first, forming a loose perimeter with the practiced ease of professional security, and then the rear door of the center vehicle opened. James Voss stepped out, except it wasn't quite James Voss, not the quiet, unremarkable ghost from Lecture Hall 3. This version wore a long, gray wool coat that fit him perfectly, his hair swept back, his bearing entirely, unmistakably different. Taller somehow, spine straight, chin level, every line of him radiating an authority so absolute it seemed to physically press down on the courtyard around him. Students who'd been chattering near the fountain went suddenly, completely silent. 2 professors crossing toward the administration building actually stopped and inclined their heads. I stood frozen with my coffee cooling in my hand as one of the suited men stepped forward and bowed. Actually bowed, and it took me a full dizzy second to recognize, beneath the sharp lines of an entirely different haircut and the absence of a gray cardigan, the quiet, unremarkable teaching assistant from the back of Halverson's lecture hall, the fire extinguisher, the coat rack, the man I had filed away as beneath notice. "Your Highness," Constantine said, his voice carrying clean and level through the hushed courtyard. The same voice, I realized with a jolt, that had murmured dry corrections over my exam papers for an entire semester without once betraying what it actually was. "The Carpathian Council requests your presence at the Border Summit. The matter of your announced consort has become urgent." I felt the coffee cup slip slightly in my hand. James's expression did not change, but something in his shoulders went rigid, his gaze flicking once, sharply, across the courtyard until it found me standing there, exposed and frozen by the fountain. For a single endless moment, his composure cracked. Something that looked almost like fear passed behind those pale eyes, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Not here," he said quietly to Constantine, and then louder to the small crowd that had gathered. "Return to your classes. There is nothing to see, it was not a request." The courtyard emptied within 30 seconds, students scattering like startled birds, leaving only James, his silent entourage, and me, rooted to the spot, my mind racing to assemble 100 scattered clues into a picture I suddenly, violently, did not want to see clearly. "Your Highness, the Carpathian Council, your announced consort." James crossed the courtyard toward me, waving off 2 guards who moved to intercept, and stopped close enough that I could see the exhaustion behind his careful composure, the particular tightness around his eyes of a man who has been dreading a specific conversation for a very long time. "Daniel," he said, and it was the first time he'd used my given name instead of Hart, and somehow that small detail undid me more than anything else. "I can explain, Highness," I repeated, testing the words, tasting how strange and impossible they felt in my mouth. As in Alaric Voss Frostwolf," he said quietly, evenly, watching my face for a reaction he'd clearly braced himself against for weeks. "Crown Alpha of the Carpathian Wolf Court, heir to the White Wolf line." A pause, his jaw tightening. "And as of this morning, apparently already engaged to a man I have never met, according to a council that seems to have forgotten I have a say in my own life." My legs, quite without my permission, sat me down hard on the edge of the fountain. "You're a king," I said faintly. "Crown Prince, technically. My father is still alive, thankfully, though not for lack of the council's efforts to hurry things along. He crouched in front of me, close enough that I could see the genuine, unguarded worry in his eyes. I came here to disappear, Daniel, to be ordinary for 1 year before I'm folded permanently into a life that was never actually mine to choose. And then you dropped your bag defending me from Richard Colborne, of all the useless creatures God ever made an alpha, and I stopped wanting to disappear at all. I stared at him, at the boy who'd hidden his crown under an oversized hoodie for months, who'd walked me home in the rain and given me his coat and made 3 armed guards flinch with a single sentence, and felt something in my chest crack open, half terror, half an emotion so overwhelming I didn't yet have a name for it. An announced consort, I said. James, Alaric, whatever your name is, they already have someone picked out for you. They do, he agreed grimly, standing and offering me his hand, which I took only because my legs still weren't fully cooperating. And I intend to inform the Carpathian Council in person precisely what they can do with that arrangement. Which means, Daniel, that I need to ask you something considerably larger than a favor. What's that? Come with me, he said. Just once. See where I actually come from, before you decide whether any of this is something you want. I said yes, which is how I found myself, 4 days later, sitting in the back of an unmarked car climbing a mountain road that stopped appearing on any map I could find, Constantine driving in careful, unhurried silence up front while Alaric, I was trying, with limited success, to think of him as Alaric now instead of James, sat close enough beside me that our knees touched every time the car took a curve. You don't have to be nervous, he said, watching me twist my scarf into a small, anxious knot in my lap. I'm about to meet your dying father and an entire council that already hates me. I think nervous is the correct response. They don't hate you, they haven't met you yet, which is different. A faint, private smile. Give them time. You're extremely difficult to hate once you start talking. Is that a compliment? It's a fact. I'd know. I tried very hard not to like you for at least 3 weeks. The fog line, when we crossed it, wasn't a physical thing so much as a felt one, a soft, prickling pressure behind my ears, like stepping through the surface of water without getting wet. And then the mountain simply opened. Where a moment before there had been only pine forest and gray rock, there was now a valley I had no memory of the car ever descending into, a city of pale stone terraces built into the mountainside itself, banners the color of fresh snow snapping in a wind that smelled of wood smoke and high, clean air, and above it all, carved into the living rock of the peak, a castle that looked less built than grown, the way frost grows across a window in winter. I started. Home, Alaric said simply, and for the first time since I'd met him, I heard something unguarded and almost shy in his voice, the voice of a boy showing someone his favorite hiding place. Welcome to the Carpathian Wolf Court, Daniel. Dinner that first night was held in a smaller hall than I'd expected, given the scale of everything else. A long table set for perhaps a dozen, warmed by an enormous hearth and lit by candles rather than the chandeliers I'd half imagined, and I understood, watching Alaric relax visibly the moment we sat down, that this was deliberate. Not a display of wealth, but a room built for exactly the kind of ordinary evening he'd spent an entire year at Lindenhall trying to have. You're allowed to eat with your hands here, for the record, he told me, low, as an entire roasted bird was set down between us with considerably less ceremony than I'd braced for. Court formality mostly lives in the throne room. My father decided decades ago that dinner shouldn't. That's the most reasonable thing I've heard all day. Wait until dessert. There's a whole argument about whether it's acceptable to lick the spoon in front of guests. Constantine has strong opinions. I do not, Constantine said, from 2 seats down, with the weary patience of a man who had clearly had this exact argument many times before. He absolutely does, Alaric said, and the warmth in his voice, easy and unguarded in a way I'd never once heard at Lindenhall, told me more about how he actually felt at home than any castle or banner ever could. I will admit, without much pride, that I did not handle the wolves gracefully. I had known, intellectually, that the frost wolf line ran pale as fresh snow in their true shape. I had not accounted for what it would feel like to watch an actual white wolf the size of a horse trot across the castle's lower courtyard, greet Constantine by shouldering companionably into his hip, and then shift, mid-stride, into a broad-shouldered young guard who straightened his uniform without so much as blinking at the transition. You get used to it, Alaric said, steadying me with a hand at my elbow when I stumbled slightly over absolutely nothing. Do you? Eventually. It took me most of a childhood. A pause. I shift too for the record. I'd rather show you when it's just us the first time. Fewer guards judging my form. Your form is judged? Extensively. Court wolves are worse gossips than court people. He said it with such dry, put-upon weariness that I laughed despite myself, despite the vertigo of the whole impossible valley, and something in his shoulders eased at the sound. King Bertrand Frostwolf received us in a private solar rather than a throne room, which I understood, once I saw him, to be a mercy rather than an oversight. He was gaunt in the particular way of a man whose illness had been arguing with him for years and was slowly, patiently winning, but his eyes, the same ice blue as his son's, were sharp and entirely, warmly present. So, he said, studying me from a chair by the window, with a directness I recognized instantly as the source of Alaric's own unflinching gaze, "You're the one who told Richard Colborne he was a coward with a trust fund." I felt my face go hot. Word travels. Word travels very fast in a court with nothing else to gossip about. A wheezing, genuine laugh, quickly gentled by a cough that made Alaric cross the room in 2 swift strides to steady his father's shoulder, the crown entirely forgotten in the plain, worried motion of a son. "Forgive me, I find I like you already, and I haven't even asked the tedious questions the council will insist upon." "Father, hush, I'm allowed to like people before the council approves it." One of the few privileges left to a dying king. He waved off Alaric's protest with a thin hand, though his eyes, when they returned to me, had gone serious. "I am not, whatever the council whispers, opposed to my son choosing his own consort, Master Hart. I was permitted no such choice myself, and I have spent 30 years watching what that cost my late husband and me both. I would very much like my son spared it, if the boy in question is willing to be patient with an old, stubborn court while it catches up to its own king." I did not in that moment trust my voice enough to answer with anything more than, "I can be patient." "Good," the king said, settling back with the satisfied air of a man who had just won a small private victory. "Then go be patient somewhere that isn't my solar, both of you. I tire easily these days, and I would like to nap without an audience." We did not, as it turned out, manage patience gracefully either, at least not on my end. I discovered over the course of that first visit that the Carpathian court ran on a thick web of customs no one had thought to warn me about, and that I possessed a truly gifted talent for violating every single one within an hour of arrival. I learned, for instance, that one did not offer a bow to a kitchen steward, because kitchen stewards outranked nearly everyone in the castle except the royal family itself, on the ancient and apparently unshakable logic that a court could survive losing its counsel but not its cook. I learned this only after bowing very formally to an elderly woman named Greta, who turned out to command the entire castle kitchens with the quiet terror of a small, iron-willed general, and who found my bow so uproariously funny that she sent an entire tray of honey cakes up to our rooms. That evening purely, she told Constantine, to reward the boy for good manners aimed in entirely the wrong direction. I learned further that one absolutely did not offer to shake hands with a wolf mid-shift, a lesson delivered by a good-natured young guard named Peter, who very nearly took my fingers off out of sheer reflexive startlement before catching himself, apologizing 11 times in a row, and then laughing so hard about it at dinner that Alaric had to explain the entire incident to his father twice. "You're going to get eaten," Alaric told me, not entirely joking, steering me away from a third such near miss by the simple expedient of tucking me firmly against his side. Not maliciously. Just structurally, you keep walking directly into the one custom guaranteed to end badly. I grew up in a 2-room flat with a beta mother and no wolves whatsoever. Forgive me for not instinctively knowing the correct greeting for a man who might turn into a horse-sized predator without warning. Wolf, horse-sized wolf, worse. At least a horse tells you what it is up front. That earned me the rare, full sound of his laugh, not the small, private, almost smile I'd catalogued so carefully back at Lindenhall, but something looser, younger, entirely unguarded, and I found myself staring at him afterward with the specific, dizzy realization that I had never once heard that sound before, not in all our weeks of tutoring and rain and stolen glances across a library table. "What?" he said, catching me looking. "Nothing. I just don't think I've ever heard you actually laugh before." Something in his expression softened, quieted. "I don't often. There isn't much room for it most days." He reached over, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear with the same careful, deliberate gentleness he'd used that rainy night under the archway. You keep finding room for it anyway. I've noticed. He showed me his true shape 3 nights later, exactly as he'd promised. Just the two of us, alone on a moonlit terrace overlooking the valley. No guards, no gossiping court wolves to judge his form. The shift itself happened almost too quickly to properly see. One moment he stood beside me in his shirt sleeves, breath fogging faintly in the cold mountain air, and the next a wolf easily the size of a large deer stood in his place. Fur so pale it seemed to glow faintly under the moon, eyes the same unmistakable ice blue that had first unsettled me across a library table months before. I started, my voice catching somewhere between awe and the particular vertigo of watching a boy I loved become, quite literally, something out of an old fairy tale. He huffed, low and amused, and pressed his broad head deliberately against my chest, patient and warm, waiting. I laughed, helpless, startled, entirely charmed, and buried both hands in fur that was absurdly, exactly as soft as it looked. While somewhere behind us, I could have sworn I heard Constantine, stationed discreetly out of sight, mutter something about the council owing him considerable money the moment word of this got out. Everything after that first visit moved with a speed that left me constantly, dizzyingly behind. Constantine, no longer disguised, no longer quiet, revealed now as the very real head of Alaric's personal guard, the man who had spent an entire semester grading economics exams, purely to keep watch over his charge from 3 seats back, took it upon himself to brief me on precisely what I'd walked into. The White Wolf line, he explained one evening. Back at Lindenhall, in the same empty classroom where he'd once corrected my supply curves in red ink, has ruled the Carpathian court since before your countries had names, Master Hart. His Majesty is dying slowly, and the council grows anxious to see the succession secured while he still draws breath to bless it. Securing it, in their minds, means a consort of appropriate lineage. He glanced at me, not unkindly, which you, I'm afraid, are not considered to possess. I gathered that much, I said, trying and failing to keep the bitterness fully out of my voice. The council has proposed Lord Julian Colbert, Constantine continued. Omega, excellent bloodline, considerable diplomatic value with the southern Pax. A sensible match, by every metric the council cares about. And by the metrics Alaric cares about? For the first time something like a smile crossed Constantine's weathered face. His Highness has made his opinion on that subject extremely, exhaustingly clear. I would not, if I were you, worry overly much about Lord Colbert. I worried anyway, because worrying was, apparently, my one reliable talent. Lord Julian Colbert arrived at Lindenhall 3 days later, golden-haired, effortlessly composed, dressed in the kind of understated, extravagant elegance that made my entire wardrobe look like it had been assembled from a laundry basket. He found me in the library, in Alaric's old dusty corner behind the agricultural records, and sat down across from me with the easy confidence of someone entirely unbothered by the situation. You must be the scholarship boy, he said, not unkindly, studying me with open, unhurried curiosity. I confess I expected someone more imposing, given the trouble you've apparently caused the council. I haven't caused anyone trouble. I've just existed near your fiancé. Julian laughed, a genuine, surprised sound. He's not my fiancé. He's never been my fiancé. That was always the council's fiction, built for exactly this occasion. To frighten a scholarship Omega into stepping quietly aside before things became inconvenient. He leaned back, arms crossed, something sharp and knowing in his pale green eyes. I have absolutely no interest in Alaric Frostwolf, Master Hart. I am, in point of fact, rather devoted to someone else entirely, which the council conveniently ignores whenever it suits their politics. I blinked at him. Then why come here at all? Because I like Alaric, Julian said simply. As a friend, since we were children running wild through the same castle halls, and because I've watched him disappear into himself for years under the weight of a crown he never wanted, and I would very much like to see him happy for once, rather than merely dutiful. He studied me a moment longer, something gentler settling into his expression. You make him smile, apparently. Actually smile, not the careful diplomatic version he's perfected for the council. That, Master Hart, is worth considerably more to me than any political arrangement. I did not, admittedly, entirely believe him. Not until I watched, 3 days later, Julian Colbert stand beside Alaric in the great hall of Lindenhall's East Wing, hastily converted for the visiting council delegation, and announce, in front of 6 visibly displeased elder alphas, that he formally and permanently withdrew his candidacy as consort to the crown alpha of the Carpathian court. His Highness, Julian said, voice carrying easily across the stunned silence, has already chosen. I would suggest, gentlemen, that the council spend its considerable energy catching up to that reality rather than fighting it. The council did not, of course, simply take Julian's word for it and disperse quietly into the night. Over the following week, I found myself the subject of a truly exhausting parade of tests I hadn't realized I was taking until they were already underway. Elder Vassarin sent a formal letter, 3 dense pages, in a hand so cramped it looked personally aggrieved, inquiring after my pack affiliations, which I did not have, my lineage of note, which consisted entirely of a beta mother who worked 2 jobs and a father I'd never met, and my capacity for diplomatic discretion, which I answered honestly by admitting I had once told Richard Colborne he was a coward with a trust fund in front of 40 witnesses. Constantine, tasked with delivering my replies, read that particular line back to himself twice before informing me, with visible effort not to smile, that he would be editing that answer slightly before submission. A second elder, a soft-spoken woman named Countess Adira, arrived at Lindenhall unannounced and spent an entire afternoon interviewing Charlotte about my character, apparently on the theory that a Scholarship Omega's closest friend would happily provide ammunition against him if properly incentivized. Charlotte, delighted by the sheer drama of being formally interviewed by Carpathian nobility, spent the full session enthusiastically describing every heroic and mildly reckless thing I ever done, including several incidents I would have greatly preferred stayed buried, and closed the interview by informing the Countess that if the council rejected me, the entire Carpathian court would have to deal with her personally, and she was already halfway done planning the strongly worded letter. She terrified me, the Countess admitted to Alaric afterward, with what sounded suspiciously like admiration. I begin to understand your taste, Your Highness. Even Professor Halverson was discreetly interviewed, a fact I only discovered when he cornered me after class to ask, bewildered, why a very polite older gentleman had spent 20 minutes asking about my punctuality and moral character before thanking him and vanishing into a car with tinted windows. I did not have a good explanation for him. I still don't. By the end of that week, the council's objections had thinned from a wall to a scattering of stubborn holdouts, chief among them Elder Vassarin, who continued to insist, with the weary persistence of a man contractually obligated to keep insisting. That tradition demanded a consort of proven lineage. It was this same insistence that finally brought us to the confrontation in the Great Hall. The council, predictably, did not simply accept defeat. Elder Vassarin, a stern, silver-eyed alpha who had apparently served 3 generations of Frostwolf kings, rose from his seat with the slow, deliberate menace of a man used to getting exactly what he wanted through simple force of will. This is unacceptable, Your Highness. A commoner Omega, foreign-born, with no pack lineage, no wolf blood, no political value whatsoever. He has my value, Alaric said. It was said quietly. It landed like thunder anyway. The version of Alaric that stood in the Great Hall that evening bore almost no resemblance to the quiet, unremarkable ghost I'd first approached in the library. He stood at the head of the long stone table with his shoulders squared and his chin level, his pale eyes gone cold and absolutely, terrifyingly still, and every alpha in that room, men who had individually more raw power than entire nations, sat back slightly in their chairs as if a chill wind had swept through. Let me be entirely clear, Alaric continued, his voice never rising, never needing to. I have spent this last year at Lindenhall specifically because the council could not be trusted to let me choose anything for myself. Not my studies, not my friendships, not the shape of my own life. I allowed that because I understood the burden of the crown, and I intended to bear it faithfully. He paused, and something colder, sharper, entirely more dangerous moved behind his eyes. What I will not allow, Elder Vassarin, is for this council to threaten, dismiss, or attempt to remove the one person in my entire life who has never once wanted anything from me but my company. Your Highness, the succession requires a consort I choose to bond with, freely of my own will, as has been true of every Frostwolf king since the founding of this court. Alaric's voice dropped, quiet and absolutely final. If the council wishes to challenge that tradition now, I invite you to explain to my father, while he is still here to hear it, precisely why you believed yourselves entitled to overrule 6 centuries of precedent for the sake of political convenience." Elder Vassarin's mouth opened, then closed again, finding nothing left to say. I had, until that exact moment, believed I understood what people meant when they described Alaric as ruthless, a word that had followed him quietly through every whispered court rumor Constantine had reluctantly shared with me over the preceding weeks. I understood it fully now, watching him dismantle an entire council's objections with nothing but stillness and absolute, unbending will, protecting me without once raising his voice. It should have frightened me. Instead, watching him turn from that intimidating stillness back toward me, his expression softening instantly into something warm and almost shy, like the boy who'd handed me his coat in the rain, I felt something in my chest settle, completely and finally, into certainty. "Daniel," he said, crossing the hall to stand before me, ignoring the assembled council entirely, "I should have told you the truth from the beginning. I was afraid that if you knew what I was, you'd see the crown before you saw me." "I saw you first," I said. I'm fairly certain I fell for the boy with the terrible fake glasses and the worst taste in oversized hoodies before I had any idea he was secretly terrifying an entire room of elder alphas into silence. The corner of his mouth curved, that same private, unpracticed smile, only surer of itself now. Was I terrifying? Extremely. I may need you to hold my hand for the rest of the evening as a precaution. He took my hand immediately, right there in front of the stunned remains of the Carpathian Council, and pressed a slow, deliberate kiss to my knuckles that sent heat rushing straight up my arm and into my suddenly burning face. "Elder Vassarin," Alaric said, without looking away from me, "you may inform my father the succession is secured. I've chosen my consort." The bonding itself happened 3 months later, once King Bertrand, steadier that season than he'd been in over a year, thanks, the court physicians admitted, to a mixture of new medicine and, they suspected, simple, stubborn happiness at seeing his son settled, had given his blessing in person, and once the council, thoroughly outmaneuvered, had grudgingly folded the announcement into an official ceremony, held not in some distant Carpathian throne room but, at Alaric's insistence, in Lindenhall's own chapel, under the same gray stone arches where he'd first draped his coat over my shoulders. "You could have any venue in Europe," I told him the morning of, adjusting his collar with hands that would not stop shaking. "Actual palaces, actual mountains. I want the place where I actually became yours," he said simply, catching my hands in his and stilling them with a gentleness that still, even now, made my breath catch. "Not the place where a crown decided it. Here." The chapel had been transformed almost beyond recognition for the occasion. White winter roses threaded through the old stone arches, candlelight instead of the gray afternoon light I remembered from tutoring sessions, the whole space smelling faintly of cedar and snow rather than dust and old books. And yet, standing at the front of it in my borrowed finery, I found I could still see the exact corner where I'd first approached a hunched, hoodie-swallowed stranger and asked, badly, terrified, for his help. "You're staring at the agricultural records section," Alaric murmured, amused, noticing the direction of my gaze. "I'm having a moment. Let me have my moment. Have as many as you like. We have the whole rest of our lives for moments." He said it so simply, so certainly, that I very nearly ruined my own composure a full 20 minutes before the ceremony was meant to begin. The bonding mark itself, the soft, deliberate press of teeth at the curve of my neck, done privately, quietly, before the public ceremony, felt nothing like the fearful stories I'd half-absorbed growing up, tales of pain and possession dressed up as romance. It felt like warmth spreading outward from that single point of contact, like something settling into place that had been unsteady my entire life, like the specific overwhelming relief of finally being exactly where you were always meant to stand. "All right," Alaric murmured against my skin, voice rough, hands framing my face with a careful, reverent tenderness that belonged entirely to this version of him. Not the crown, not the ruthless authority that had silenced an entire council, just James. Just Alaric, just the boy who ran warm and smelled like cedar and old library paper. "More than all right," I said, and felt him smile against my throat. Richard Colborne, notably, did not attend the ceremony, having transferred to another academy, shortly after learning precisely whose sleeve he'd grabbed in that courtyard. Julian Colbert did attend, seated beside a tall, quiet beta named Thomas, whose hand he held throughout the entire ceremony with an unguarded happiness that made it very clear exactly who he'd been so devoted to all along. Charlotte sat in the second row in a borrowed dress 2 sizes too fashionable for her budget, crying loudly and unapologetically through the entire thing, and loudly informing anyone within earshot that she had, in fact, called it back in September. "I told you I had no interest in stealing your king," Julian said afterward, toasting me with genuine warmth in his pale green eyes. "Congratulations, Your Highness." I startled at the title, still unused to it landing on me. "Please don't call me that." "You'll get used to it," Julian said, laughing. "Or you won't, and it'll be very entertaining to watch you flinch every time for the next 60 years. King Bertrand, seated in a place of honor near the front, one hand steady on his cane, and the other pressed briefly to his chest as though holding something in, watched the whole ceremony with an expression I would carry with me for the rest of my life. Not merely relief, but something closer to peace, the particular contentment of a man who has finally seen the one thing he most feared he'd run out of time for. "I intend," he told me quietly afterward, gripping my hand with more strength than I expected from him, "to be an extremely inconvenient nuisance at every anniversary you two ever have. Do not think illness will spare you my opinions on the wedding cake." He was, true to his word, still very much alive and very much opinionated a full year later, 1 year into being married to a crown alpha king. I have learned several important facts about domestic life in the Carpathian court that no council briefing ever bothered to mention. The first is that Alaric Frostwolf, terror of the council, silencer of elder alphas, ruthless negotiator whose name still made border diplomats visibly nervous, is catastrophically, hopelessly incapable of making coffee correctly. "You've burned it again," I told him. One frostbright morning in our private quarters overlooking the eastern mountains, watching him stare down at the smoking kettle with the same still, unreadable expression he'd once used on Elder Vassaran. "The council fears me," he said mournfully. "This kettle does not. The kettle has clearly done its research." He set the ruined pot down with the deliberate care of a man considering a battle and pulled me instead into a slow, warm embrace, tuck his face against my neck right over the soft, permanent mark he'd left there a year earlier. "I have conquered exactly nothing this morning," he murmured against my skin. "I demand a kiss as consolation. You demand a great many things. Only from you," he said, and the utter, unguarded sincerity in it still, after a full year, made my chest go warm and tight in equal measure. The second important fact is that the Carpathian court, for all its ancient formality, had developed a peculiar and enduring fondness for gossiping about the two of us, a fact I discovered when Constantine, still head of Alaric's guard and now, apparently, an incorrigible gossip in his off hours, informed me over breakfast that the entire palace staff had a running wager on how long it would take Alaric to lose an argument with me in public. "There is no wager," Alaric said flatly, not looking up from his correspondence. "There is absolutely a wager, Your Highness," Constantine said, entirely unbothered. "Currently standing at 3 losses this month alone, I do not lose arguments with my consort. I make strategic concessions. You conceded an entire trade negotiation last week because Daniel made that face at you." "What face?" I asked, delighted. "The face," Constantine said solemnly. "That makes His Highness forget he is, by all official records, the single most feared alpha south of the Baltic." Alaric set down his pen with the exact weary dignity of a man who knows he is completely and permanently outmatched. "I would like it noted," he said, "that I remain, in every meaningful sense, a ruthless king." "Of course, dear," I said, kissing the top of his head as I passed, which earned me a swat at my retreating hip and the distinct, satisfying sound of him failing entirely to hide his laughter. Charlotte visits twice a year now, under the very official-sounding title of Royal Correspondent, a job Alaric invented purely, I suspect, so she could keep teasing me with diplomatic immunity. King Bertrand, against every prognosis his physicians had quietly prepared us for, still holds court twice a week and still finds new and increasingly specific opinions about our choice of curtains. Julian and Thomas visit every winter, and every winter Julian informs me with great satisfaction exactly how many arguments Alaric has lost since his last visit. My own first official duty as consort, 6 months into the marriage, was to formally receive a delegation from the Southern Pax, the same Southern Pax Julian Colbert had once been meant to secure through marriage. and I spent the entire preceding week rehearsing the correct bow depth for visiting alphas of varying rank, until Alaric finally took my hands mid-practice and informed me, with visible amusement, that I had been bowing to an empty chair for the last 20 minutes. I panicked, I admitted. The chair looked important. The chair, he said solemnly, is in fact my father's second favorite reading chair, and I am now obligated to tell him you bowed to it. He will never let either of us forget this. He did not, in fact, ever let us forget it. King Bertrand had the chair formally engraved with a small brass plaque reading, in careful court script, bowed to by the consort, out of an abundance of caution, and it remains, to this day, the single most popular stop on any visiting dignitary's tour of the castle. The third fact, the one I hold closest, the one I turn over privately in the quiet moments between council sessions and diplomatic dinners and the ordinary, precious business of an actual shared life, is that the boy who once hid an entire kingdom's worth of weight beneath an oversized hoodie in the back of Lecture Hall 3 still, even now, looks at me across a crowded room the exact same way he did that rainy night under a borrowed umbrella, like I am the single most interesting thing he has ever chosen to notice. "What are you thinking about?" Alaric asked one evening, months into our first winter as bonded mates, catching me watching him across our quiet sitting room as snow fell soft and silent against the tall windows. "That I once thought you were a ghost," I said, "the most forgettable boy at Lindenhall." He crossed the room and settled beside me, pulling me easily against his chest, his chin resting warm atop my head. "And now?" "Now I think," I said, tucking myself against the steady, familiar warmth of him, "that you were simply waiting for the one person who'd bother to look closely enough to see you at all." Outside, the White Wolf's mountains stood ancient and silent under the falling snow. Inside, wrapped in the arms of a ruthless king who had once given a stranger his coat in the rain, and never quite taken his heart back afterward, I discovered, quietly, happily, without any council's blessing required, that some kingdoms are built not from crowns or bloodlines, but from exactly this: two people choosing each other again and again on purpose. If this story pulled at something in you, drop a comment and tell us which moment hit hardest. We genuinely read every single one. A like helps more people find stories like this, and subscribing means you will never miss the next one. Thank you for spending this time with us. It truly means more than you know.